A group of cocky bullies mock a 79-year-old veteran in karate class, laughing at his shaky hands, calling him grandpa, even filming his every stumble. But what they don't know is, this man isn't just any old student. Behind those slow movements lies the deadliest training the military's ever seen. When one of them says, "Prove it, old man," he does, in under 60 seconds. But what made him hold back all this time? And what happens when their cruelty goes too far? Off the mat? How far will a warrior go when he's forced to stop showing mercy? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Franklin Kowalski stood at the entrance of Blue Mountain Taekwondo, his weathered hands gripping his cane a little tighter than necessary. The familiar scent of athletic gear and rubber mats brought back memories of his military training days, though those had been nearly 6 decades ago. At 79 years old, he wasn't sure what he was doing here, except that his granddaughter Penny had insisted. "It'll help strengthen your knee, Grandpa," she had said, her caring eyes full of concern. "The movements are controlled and deliberate, perfect for rehabilitation." Franklin took a deep breath and pushed open the glass door. The sound of bare feet slapping against mats and sharp keyhaps filled the air. Young students in crisp white uniforms moved through their exercises with varying degrees of skill. Some looked as young as 10, while others appeared to be in their 20s or 30s. A muscular man in his mid-20s, wearing a black belt with several gold stripes, stood at the front of the class. His stance radiated confidence that bordered on arrogance. This had to be Tyler Morrison, the head instructor Penny had mentioned. "Can I help you?" a young woman at the front desk asked cheerfully. Franklin straightened his back, trying to minimize his slight tremor. "Yes, I'm here for the beginners class. Franklin Kowalski." "Oh, right," your granddaughter called ahead. "Let me get you some paperwork." As Franklin carefully filled out the forms, he watched Tyler Morrison leading the current class. The instructor's teaching style was aggressive, his voice sharp and demanding. Franklin recognized the type, someone who confused fear with respect. When the previous class ended, Franklin made his way to the changing room. He emerged wearing the white uniform Penny had bought him, feeling both nostalgic and slightly foolish. His knee ached as he stepped onto the mat, but he kept his face neutral, the way he'd learned during his years as a Marine colonel. "Everyone line up!" Tyler's voice boomed across the room. His eyes landed on Franklin, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Well, looks like we have a new student. Hope you can keep up, old-timer." A few younger students snickered, but Franklin merely nodded, his face impassive. He'd faced worse in Korea than a cocky instructor with something to prove. The warm-up exercises began, and Franklin's body protested every movement. His hands shook as he tried to hold the basic stances, and sweat beaded on his forehead. The jumping jacks were particularly challenging. His recent knee surgery made each landing feel like a shock through his leg. "Come on, Grandpa," Tyler called out, not bothering to hide his disdain. "My 5-year-old nephew can do better jumping jacks than that." Franklin continued at his own pace, ignoring the taunt. He caught Tyler watching him in the mirror, the instructor's expression a mixture of amusement and annoyance. Franklin recognized that look too, the face of someone who saw weakness as an opportunity rather than a call for compassion. Throughout the class, Franklin observed everything around him. He noticed how Tyler favored his left side slightly, how he used his height to intimidate smaller students, and how his teaching focused more on showing off his own skills than developing those of his students. Years of military experience had taught Franklin to read people, and what he saw in Tyler Morrison concerned him. When they moved on to basic punching techniques, Franklin's hands trembled more noticeably. Tyler walked over, standing too close, his presence deliberately intimidating. "Maybe you should stick to bingo night at the senior center," Tyler said, loud enough for nearby students to hear. "This isn't a place for shaky hands and weak knees." Franklin met Tyler's gaze steadily. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Morrison," he replied quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat. "But I believe I'll continue." Something flickered in Tyler's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or irritation at not getting the reaction he'd hoped for. He moved away, but Franklin could feel the instructor's attention returning to him throughout the class, like a predator sizing up potential prey. By the end of the session, Franklin's knee was throbbing, and his uniform was soaked with sweat. But he had completed the class, moving through each exercise at his own pace, maintaining his dignity despite Tyler's attempts to humiliate him. As the students bowed out, Franklin noticed Tyler watching him with narrowed eyes. The message was clear. The instructor didn't want him there and would make future classes increasingly difficult. But Franklin had survived 3 years in Korea and decades in the Marines. He'd faced down enemy soldiers and navigated military politics. He wasn't about to let a bullying instructor half his age drive him away. Franklin changed back into his street clothes slowly, his muscles protesting every movement. But as he walked out of the dojo, leaning on his cane, his back was straight and his head held high. He might appear vulnerable, but anyone who had looked closely during class, really looked, might have noticed that his eyes missed nothing, that his quiet demeanor masked decades of experience, and that beneath his frail exterior lay the heart of a warrior who had faced far worse challenges than an arrogant young instructor with something to prove. The following week, Franklin arrived early for his second class at Blue Mountain Taekwondo. His knee still ached from the previous session, but he moved with quiet determination as he changed into his crisp white uniform. The memories of Tyler Morrison's dismissive comments from last week lingered in his mind, but decades of military service had taught him to focus on the mission at hand. Other students filtered into the training hall, their cheerful chatter echoing off the mirrored walls. Franklin took his place at the back of the class, carefully stretching his recovering knee. He caught a few curious glances from his fellow students, but their attention quickly shifted as Tyler strode onto the mat. "Line up!" Tyler's voice carried the same arrogant edge Franklin remembered. The instructor's eyes landed on Franklin, and a smirk spread across his face. "Well, look who's back. I guess the senior center was closed today." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the class. Franklin maintained his composure, face neutral as he bowed with the others. 24 years old and already so bitter, he thought, recognizing the familiar pattern of insecurity masked by aggression. They began with basic forms practice, and Tyler wasted no time in making Franklin his target. As the elderly veteran moved through the fundamental positions, Tyler circled him like a shark that had caught the scent of blood. "No, no, no," Tyler announced loudly, stopping in front of Franklin. "Your stances are all wrong, Grandpa. This isn't shuffleboard, you know." He demonstrated the move with exaggerated slowness, drawing more nervous laughter from some students. Franklin adjusted his stance slightly, maintaining his focus despite the mockery. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, some showing discomfort at their instructor's behavior, others trying to avoid looking altogether. "Maybe we should get you some water wings and sign you up for senior water aerobics instead," Tyler continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "At least there you won't have to worry about falling over." A young woman in the front row frowned, clearly troubled by the instructor's unprofessional conduct, but she remained silent. Franklin understood her reluctance. Speaking up against authority wasn't easy, especially when that authority showed so little regard for basic respect. As they moved through more complex forms, Tyler's ridicule became increasingly pointed. "Look at those shaky hands. I've seen more stability in a coffee addict going through withdrawal." He gestured dramatically at Franklin's slightly trembling fingers, making sure everyone could see. "This is martial arts, not palsy practice." Franklin continued his movements, each motion deliberate and focused despite his physical limitations. His face remained impassive, but inside, he drew upon the same discipline that had carried him through 3 years of combat in Korea. He'd faced enemy fire with less hostility than this young man's petty attempts at humiliation. Some of the other students were now openly exchanging concerned glances. A teenage boy near Franklin shifted uncomfortably, looking like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the courage. The atmosphere in the dojo had grown tense, heavy with unspoken disapproval of Tyler's behavior. "Hey, Grandpa," Tyler called out again, his former MMA fighter's confidence evident in his swagger as he approached Franklin. "Maybe you should stick to playing chess in the park. This kind of training requires actual coordination." Franklin completed the form sequence before responding, his voice steady and controlled. "Thank you for your suggestions, Mr. Morrison. Shall we continue with the lesson?" Tyler's eyes narrowed at Franklin's calm response, clearly frustrated by his inability to provoke a reaction. The instructor's professional facade cracked further as he barked out increasingly difficult movements, watching Franklin struggle with barely concealed satisfaction. But Franklin persisted, his military bearing evident in every careful movement. When his knee protested, he adjusted. When his hands shook, he focused harder. Each taunt from Tyler was met with the same quiet determination that had served Franklin through decades of service. As the class drew to a close, the other students seemed to have developed a new appreciation for the elderly veteran's resilience. Several nodded respectfully as they passed him, though they were careful to do so when Tyler wasn't watching. Franklin changed slowly in the locker room, his body sore, but his spirit unbowed. He could hear Tyler in the hallway, his voice carrying through the door as he complained to someone about lowering standards by accepting geriatric students. Leaning on his cane as he emerged, Franklin noticed a few of his classmates lingering by the front desk, their expressions troubled as they watched him leave. He gave them a small nod, understanding their silent support even if they weren't ready to voice it. The evening air was cool as Franklin made his way to his car, his movements measured but determined. Tyler's mockery had been crude and unprofessional, but it had only strengthened Franklin's resolve to continue. He hadn't survived war and commanded troops by backing down from bullies, regardless of their age or position. As he drove home, Franklin reflected on the class. Tyler's behavior revealed far more about the instructor's character than it did about Franklin's capabilities. The young man's need to publicly humiliate an elderly student spoke volumes about his own insecurities and lack of true leadership qualities. The following week brought new challenges as Tyler's influence spread among his favored students. Brett Hoffman, a muscular young man with an aggressive streak, began watching Franklin with the same predatory interest as his instructor. During partner drills, Brett made his way through the class until he stood directly in front of Franklin. "Looks like I'm your partner today, old-timer," Brett said, his smile lacking any warmth. The practice involved basic blocking techniques, with partners taking turns throwing controlled punches. But Brett's movements were anything but controlled. He deliberately crowded Franklin's space, forcing the elderly veteran to step backward. When Franklin tried to maintain his position, Brett accidentally bumped into him, causing him to stumble. Franklin's knee buckled slightly, and he had to catch himself against the wall. "Oops," Brett said loudly, drawing attention from nearby students. "Maybe you need a walker for this part." From across the room, Tyler watched with obvious amusement, but said nothing about his student's dangerous behavior. Franklin steadied himself and resumed his stance, his face betraying no emotion despite the clear provocation. Landon Cruz, another of Tyler's inner circle, joined in the harassment. During forms practice, he positioned himself behind Franklin and began mimicking the veteran's careful movements. His exaggerated gestures, complete with trembling hands and wobbling knees, drew snickers from some of the younger students. "Look at me, I'm Grandpa trying to kick," Landon whispered loudly enough for those nearby to hear. He performed an intentionally shaky version of a front kick, causing more suppressed laughter. Brett pulled out his phone, holding it at waist level to avoid obvious detection. He began recording Franklin's attempts at basic stances and kicks, capturing moments when the elderly man's balance wavered or his movements showed the limitations of his recovery. "This is going to get so many views," Brett muttered to Landon, both of them grinning as they watched the phone's screen. Wait until everyone sees the geriatric ninja in action." Franklin noticed their filming, but maintained his focus on the training. His military bearing showed in his straight posture and disciplined approach, even as sweat began to show on his forehead from the effort of maintaining proper form. During a water break, Brett and Landon huddled together, reviewing their footage and adding mocking captions for their planned social media posts. Their laughter carried across the training hall, drawing more students into their circle to view their handiwork. The harassment continued throughout the class. When students paired up for kicking drills, Brett made sure to partner with Franklin again. This time, he held the practice pad at awkward angles, forcing Franklin to overextend his recovering knee. "Come on, old man, put some power into it," Brett taunted, yanking the pad away just as Franklin kicked. The veteran's leg swept through empty air, causing him to momentarily lose his balance. Landon captured this moment on his phone, zooming in on Franklin's struggle to regain his footing. "Perfect," he whispered to Brett. "That one's definitely going online." Some students watched uncomfortably but remained silent, unwilling to challenge Tyler's favorite pupils. Franklin continued his training with stoic determination, his face set in concentration as he worked through each exercise despite the constant harassment. During the final stretching session, Brett and Landon positioned themselves on either side of Franklin. They took turns bumping into him as they moved through the stretches, making it appear accidental while exchanging knowing looks. "Sorry about that," Brett said with fake sincerity after a particularly hard bump. "These young legs of mine just have so much energy." Franklin absorbed their provocations without complaint, his military training evident in his composed response to their intimidation tactics. He moved through the stretches with careful precision, refusing to let their behavior drive him from the class. As students began to pack up their gear, Brett and Landon made a show of reviewing their collected videos. They held the phone screen where Franklin could clearly see it, watching his reaction as they scrolled through their mockery of his training efforts. "Hey, want to see your highlight reel?" Brett called out, but Franklin simply continued gathering his belongings, his movements deliberate and dignified despite the obvious attempt to humiliate him. The veteran's refusal to engage only seemed to frustrate his tormentors more. They followed him to the edge of the mat, continuing their performance of exaggerated imitations of his movements. "Look at me. I'm a tough old Marine who can barely stand up," Landon mocked, wobbling dramatically while Brett filmed his performance. Franklin walked past them without acknowledgement, his bearing straight despite his tired muscles and aching knee. He changed out of his uniform with the same careful movements he'd shown throughout class, unhurried despite the sound of laughter from the hallway where Brett and Landon continued their commentary. The elderly veteran's face remained impassive as he gathered his belongings, but his eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had faced far worse challenges than schoolyard bullies. His refusal to quit in the face of their escalating intimidation spoke of years of military discipline and an unshakable determination to continue, despite their best efforts to drive him away. That evening, Brett sat in his bedroom, hunched over his phone with a satisfied smirk on his face. His fingers moved quickly across the screen as he added cruel captions to the videos he'd captured of Franklin during class. "Watch Grandpa try to kick. Someone get this fossil a walker," he typed, chuckling to himself. "Dude, check this one out," Brett texted to Landon, sharing a clip where Franklin had stumbled during a basic stance transition. He'd edited the video to play in slow motion, emphasizing every wobble and moment of unsteadiness. Landon responded immediately with laughing emojis. "Perfect. Let's post it everywhere. Old man thinks he can hang with real martial artists?" Within hours, their videos spread across multiple social media platforms. Comments poured in from other students at the dojo and soon reached beyond their immediate circle. Some viewers added their own mocking remarks, while others created cruel memes using screenshots of Franklin's most vulnerable moments. "Look at this ancient warrior trying to relive his glory days," read one caption beneath a photo of Franklin struggling with a stretching exercise. Meanwhile, across town, Penny Kowalski noticed subtle changes in her grandfather during their weekly family dinner. Franklin sat more stiffly than usual, wincing slightly when he reached for the salt shaker. His usual animated stories about his day were replaced with brief, non-committal responses. "How are the martial arts classes going, Grandpa?" Penny asked, her trained physical therapist's eye noting the fresh bruises peeking out from under his shirt sleeve. Franklin adjusted his position, carefully keeping his right arm below the table. "Fine," he said shortly. "The exercise is good for my knee rehabilitation." Penny watched as he used his left hand to lift his water glass, avoiding movement in his right shoulder. "Are you sure you're not pushing yourself too hard? Those look like some nasty bruises." "Training involves contact," Franklin replied, his tone carrying the same authority he'd used during his years as a Marine colonel. "I don't run from fights, never have. This is no different." "But Grandpa, rehabilitation shouldn't leave you looking like you've been in a battle," Penny pressed gently. "Maybe we should look into a different program." Franklin's face hardened slightly. "The program is fine. I've handled worse than a few bumps and bruises during my service. This is helping my knee, just like you suggested." Penny noticed how he withdrew from the conversation after that, focusing intently on his meal. His usual warmth and engagement with family discussions was replaced by short answers and long silences. The change worried her more than the physical signs of rough treatment. Back online, Brett and Landon's campaign continued to gain traction. They created a dedicated account called Grandpa Fails to showcase their growing collection of Franklin's training footage. Each new post attracted more viewers, with comments ranging from casual mockery to outright cruel suggestions. "Maybe we should add some sound effects," Landon suggested in a text. "You know, like creaking bones when he tries to kick?" Brett replied enthusiastically. "Already on it. Wait until you see what I did with today's footage. Added a walker sound effect every time he steps." The videos became more elaborate, with edited effects and superimposed graphics making fun of Franklin's age and careful movements. As some clips were slowed down and set to exaggerated, old-time music, while others featured added commentary mocking his military background. "Attention! Former tough guy can't even throw a proper punch anymore," read the caption on their latest post. The video showed Franklin practicing basic striking techniques, his movements deliberately measured as he worked within his recovery limitations. At another family gathering that weekend, Penny noticed her grandfather checking his watch repeatedly, eager to leave early. His usual stories about his military service and life experiences were conspicuously absent from the conversation. When their cousin mentioned martial arts, Franklin quickly changed the subject. "Are you sleeping okay, Grandpa?" Penny asked, noting the tired lines around his eyes. "You seem more withdrawn lately." Franklin straightened in his chair, his military bearing taking over. "I'm fine, Penny. Just focused on my recovery. The training takes concentration and energy, that's all." "You know you can talk to me if something's bothering you," she said softly. "If anyone at the dojo is being too rough." "I said I'm fine," Franklin cut her off, his tone firm but gentle. "I don't need special treatment or protection. I've been taking care of myself since before you were born." Penny watched as her grandfather excused himself early from dinner, citing the need to rest before his next training session. His steps were measured and careful, but she could see the tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before he started the martial arts classes. As Franklin drove home that evening, Brett was adding the finishing touches to their most elaborate video yet. It was a compilation of Franklin's struggles set to circus music, with animated effects making fun of his age and military background. The post was titled, "Watch this senior citizen pretend to be a tough guy." "This is going to blow up," Brett texted Landon. "Can't wait to see the old man's face when he finally discovers he's internet famous." Penny sat at her kitchen table early Sunday morning, staring at the untouched coffee growing cold before her. Her grandfather's behavior at yesterday's family dinner kept replaying in her mind. Franklin had always been the life of their gatherings, sharing stories from his military days that had the younger cousins hanging on every word. But now he seemed like a different person. Quiet, withdrawn, and constantly checking the time as if eager to escape. She picked up her phone and scrolled through recent photos, stopping at one taken just 2 months ago. Franklin stood tall and proud at her brother's wedding, his dress blues still fitting perfectly despite the decades since his service. His smile was genuine then, his eyes bright with joy. The contrast with his current demeanor made her heart ache. Later that afternoon, Penny drove to Franklin's house, determined to have a real conversation about what was happening at the dojo. She found him in his garage, methodically organizing his tools, a habit he'd developed during his Marine Corps days that always helped him think. "Grandpa," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. "Can we talk?" Franklin turned slowly, and Penny noticed how he favored his left side. "Of course, sweetheart. Hand me that wrench, would you?" As she passed him the tool, her trained eye caught sight of fresh bruising along his forearm. These weren't the typical marks from martial arts practice. They were darker, more deliberate. "Those are new," she said, gesturing to his arm. Franklin pulled down his sleeve quickly. "Just part of training. Contact sports involve contact?" "Grandpa, I'm a physical therapist. I know the difference between training bruises and—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "And something else." "Penny?" His voice carried the same commanding tone he'd used leading Marines. "I appreciate your concern, but I can handle myself." She stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've always taught us to stand up against bullies. Why won't you let me help you now?" Franklin's weathered face softened slightly. "Some battles need to be fought alone, sweetheart. I've been handling difficult situations since before you were born." "But you don't have to," Penny insisted, her voice thick with emotion. "I recommended this program for your rehabilitation. If someone's hurting you—" "Nobody's hurting me," Franklin interrupted, his jaw set firmly. "I'm not some fragile old man who needs protecting. I earned my rank by facing challenges head-on, not by running to others when things got tough." Penny watched as he turned back to his workbench, his movements careful and measured. She recognized the familiar set of his shoulders, the same posture he'd maintained through her grandmother's funeral, through his knee surgery, through every hardship he'd faced. It was his armor, built from decades of military discipline and pride. "At least let me come watch a class," she suggested. "As a physical therapist, I could—" "No." Franklin's response was immediate and firm. "This is my training, my challenge to face. I won't have my granddaughter fighting my battles." Penny felt tears welling up in her eyes. "But that's what family does, Grandpa. We support each other, like you've always supported us." Franklin turned back to her, his expression softening at the sight of her tears. "Come here, sweetheart." He opened his arms, and Penny stepped into his embrace, careful not to press against his bruised side. "You know what your grandmother used to say about tough times?" "That they show us what we're made of," Penny whispered against his shoulder. "That's right. And I'm made of pretty stern stuff. These old bones have weathered worse storms than this." He pulled back slightly, meeting her worried gaze. "Trust me to handle this my way. Please." Penny saw the determination in his eyes, the same unwavering resolve that had carried him through combat and loss. She recognized that pushing harder now would only make him withdraw further. "Promise me something then," she said, wiping her eyes. "Promise you'll tell me if it gets worse. Promise you won't let pride keep you from asking for help if you really need it." Franklin's face creased in a small smile. "I promise to be careful. That's the best I can offer." As Penny drove home that evening, her heart was heavy with unspoken concerns. She knew her grandfather's sense of honor would keep him from breaking his word, but she also knew his definition of careful might be very different from hers. The proud Marine colonel who had faced combat wouldn't easily admit when a situation had become too much to handle alone. She pulled into her driveway and sat there for a long moment, remembering all the times her grandfather had protected their family, from schoolyard bullies to life's hardest moments. Now he was facing his own battle, and his military training and pride were keeping him from accepting help. The man who had always been their family's guardian was struggling with accepting that sometimes even guardians need protection. The evening class at the dojo started like any other, with students lining up in their crisp white uniforms. Tyler Morrison stood at the front, his usual arrogant smirk playing across his face as he surveyed the group. Franklin took his place at the back, moving carefully but deliberately through the warm-up exercises. "Tonight, we're going to focus on practical self-defense," Tyler announced, his voice carrying an edge that made several students exchange nervous glances. "Sometimes you need to know how to handle yourself against a larger, more aggressive opponent." His eyes settled on Franklin with mock concern. "Or in some cases, how to defend against someone who might be slower." Scattered laughter rippled through the class. Tyler gestured to Brett, who stepped forward with an eager grin. "Brett here will help me demonstrate some important principles, and..." He paused for effect. "I think we could all learn something from watching our most experienced student participate." Franklin felt every eye in the room turn toward him. He maintained his composure, decades of military discipline evident in his steady gaze and squared shoulders. "Colonel Kowalski," Tyler called out, false respect dripping from his voice. "Would you mind helping us demonstrate these techniques?" Franklin stepped forward without hesitation, though his movements were measured and careful. His weathered hands hung loose at his sides as he took his position on the mat. "Now Brett will play the role of aggressor," Tyler explained, holding up his phone to record the demonstration. "Colonel, I want you to show us how you would defend against a basic attack sequence." Brett's aggressive stance telegraphed his intentions clearly. He was nearly twice Franklin's size, his young muscles coiled with barely contained energy. The elderly veteran stood quietly, watching with calm assessment as Brett began to circle. "Begin!" Tyler called out. Brett launched forward with a series of rapid punches. Franklin's movements appeared sluggish as he tried to block, his responses coming too late. A sharp jab caught him in the ribs, drawing a collective gasp from the class. "Come on, Grandpa," Brett taunted, growing bolder with each successful strike. "Show us those combat skills you're always talking about." Franklin stumbled backward, his breathing labored. Tyler zoomed in with his phone, capturing every moment of the older man's apparent helplessness. "Remember, folks," he narrated loudly, "this is why we need to be realistic about our limitations as we age." The class's laughter grew louder as Brett continued his assault. He landed another solid hit to Franklin's shoulder, causing the veteran to stagger. Someone in the back made a crack about senior citizen discounts at the hospital. "Maybe we should get him a walker," another student called out, encouraged by Tyler's approving chuckle. Brett pressed his advantage, throwing a combination that forced Franklin against the wall. The elderly man's movements seemed increasingly uncoordinated, his blocks ineffective against the younger student's aggression. "This is gold," Tyler muttered, adjusting his phone's angle to capture Franklin's face. "When grandpas think they're tough, this'll go viral for sure." Franklin absorbed another hit, his expression unchanging despite the impact. But something shifted in his eyes, a dangerous glint that flickered briefly before disappearing behind his mask of vulnerability. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed how his stumbles always kept him just out of range of Brett's power strikes, how his seemingly random movements maintained a precise distance from his opponent. "Come on, old man," Brett sneered, winding up for another combination. "Show us what the Marine Corps taught you." Tyler circled the pair, narrating for his video. "See how age affects reaction time? This is why it's important to know your limits, folks. Not everyone is cut out for martial arts, especially after a certain age." The humiliation continued for several more minutes, with Brett landing calculated strikes while Franklin appeared to barely stay on his feet. The class's laughter and jeers grew louder, encouraged by Tyler's running commentary. Finally, Tyler called an end to the demonstration. Franklin stood quietly, his breathing controlled despite the exertion. A few bruises were already forming on his exposed arms, but his face remained impassive. "Let's thank our volunteers," Tyler announced, his voice thick with mock sincerity. "I think we've all learned some valuable lessons about knowing our limitations." He turned to Franklin with false concern. "Colonel, maybe you should take a break and ice those bruises. We wouldn't want you to miss your early bird special dinner." Fresh laughter erupted from the class. Franklin simply bowed, maintaining perfect military posture despite his apparent beating. As he stepped off the mat, his eyes met Tyler's for a brief moment. Something in that steady gaze made Tyler's smirk falter slightly, though he quickly covered it by turning to address the class. "All right, everyone pair up. Let's practice those defensive combinations," Tyler called out, already thinking about how many views his video would get. He missed the calculating look that crossed Franklin's face as the elderly veteran returned to his place at the back of the class, moving with the same measured care as always. Brett circled Franklin like a predator, emboldened by his earlier success. The elderly veteran's shoulders slumped slightly, his breathing labored from the previous exchanges. Tyler continued filming, his phone tracking every moment of Franklin's apparent helplessness. "Let's see how you handle this, old-timer," Brett sneered, launching into a vicious combination. His fists whistled through the air, a right cross followed by a left hook, then a powerful uppercut aimed at Franklin's chin. In that fraction of a second, something changed. Franklin's entire demeanor transformed, his tired posture vanished, replaced by a stillness that radiated deadly focus. His eyes, previously clouded with apparent confusion, suddenly blazed with Arctic intensity. The change was so dramatic that Brett's uppercut froze mid-trajectory, his confidence evaporating under that bone-chilling gaze. The atmosphere in the dojo shifted. Several students who had been laughing moments before fell silent, sensing the sudden tension. Franklin's hands, which had been shaking earlier, now hung perfectly steady at his sides. His stance, though still appearing casual, somehow commanded the space around him. Brett felt his throat go dry. The elderly man before him no longer seemed frail or vulnerable. Instead, Brett found himself facing something that triggered a primal warning in his brain. The presence of a predator far more dangerous than himself. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. Franklin's eyes held Brett's with unwavering focus, decades of combat experience evident in that single look. His muscles twitched with remembered violence, hands automatically shifting into positions that promised swift and brutal efficiency. Then, just as quickly, Franklin blinked. The deadly presence receded like a wave, pulling back from the shore. His shoulders slumped again, and the familiar tremor returned to his hands. But Brett remained frozen, his aggressive confidence shattered by what he had glimpsed. "What's the holdup?" Tyler called out, lowering his phone slightly. "Keep going, Brett. Show us how it's done." Brett swallowed hard, struggling to reconcile the dangerous fighter he had just sensed with the seemingly helpless old man before him. His next punch came out hesitant and weak. Franklin absorbed the hit with his previous awkwardness, but several students had noticed the change. In the back of the class, two senior belt holders exchanged meaningful glances. A quiet brown belt near the wall straightened her posture, watching Franklin with new appreciation. "Come on, Brett, put some power into it!" Tyler shouted, oblivious to the subtle shift in the room's energy. "This isn't senior citizen yoga." Brett threw another combination, but his movements lacked their earlier certainty. Each time he stepped in, his eyes searched Franklin's face for any sign of that lethal focus returning. The elderly veteran maintained his appearance of vulnerability, yet something had fundamentally changed in the dynamic between them. "What's wrong with you?" Tyler demanded, growing frustrated with Brett's hesitation. "Hit him like you mean it!" Franklin stumbled slightly, his movements once again appearing uncoordinated. But one particularly observant student noticed how that stumble perfectly positioned him just outside Brett's striking range. Another caught how Franklin's supposedly random shuffling always kept him balanced and ready to move in any direction. Brett launched a final flurry of attacks. but his heart wasn't in it anymore. Each time his fist approached Franklin, he half expected those cold eyes to return. The memory of that brief moment had shaken him more than he cared to admit. "Pathetic," Tyler muttered, though he kept filming. "I thought you were going to show us some real action, Brett." The younger fighter backed away, unable to shake the feeling that he had just escaped something far more dangerous than he had initially assumed. Franklin stood quietly, once again the picture of an elderly man trying his best to keep up with the younger students. But the illusion had cracked. Those who had witnessed that moment of transformation watched Franklin with new eyes, seeing hints of deadly grace in his supposedly clumsy movements. They noticed how his mistakes never left him truly vulnerable, how his apparent weakness masked perfect balance and control. Tyler remained focused on his phone screen, already planning how to edit the video for maximum humiliation. "All right, that's enough," he announced, waving Brett back to his position. "I think we've all seen plenty of what not to do." The class resumed its normal routine, but an undercurrent of tension remained. Brett kept his distance from Franklin, his earlier bravado replaced by uncertain glances. Other students found themselves paying closer attention to the elderly veteran's movements, looking for glimpses of what they had witnessed. Franklin returned to his spot at the back of the class, moving with the same careful steps as before. But now, a few students noticed how those measured movements resembled a tiger padding quietly through tall grass, the lethal power carefully hidden, but ever present. The facade had slipped, if only for a moment. And while Tyler continued his mockery, gleefully reviewing the footage on his phone, those who had seen beneath Franklin's mask understood that they were watching something far more interesting than an old man struggling with martial arts. They were watching a master of deception at work, though none of them could guess why such a dangerous man would choose to appear so vulnerable. The dojo's front door chimed, drawing everyone's attention. Master Kim Sung-ho stood in the entrance, his dignified presence commanding immediate respect. The 65-year-old Korean master moved with quiet grace as he stepped onto the training floor, his traditional black uniform crisp and perfectly pressed. Tyler quickly lowered his phone, straightening his posture. "Master Kim, we weren't expecting you today," he said, trying to hide his nervousness. Master Kim didn't respond. His eyes had locked onto Franklin, who stood quietly at the back of the class. The elderly Korean's expression transformed from casual observation to shocked recognition. His mouth fell slightly open, and his normally composed features reflected deep emotion. The entire class watched in confusion as Master Kim walked directly toward Franklin, his steps becoming more purposeful with each stride. Franklin remained still, maintaining his appearance of frailty even as the studio owner approached. When Master Kim reached Franklin, he did something that made several students gasp. The respected master dropped into a deep, formal bow, the kind usually reserved for the highest-ranking martial artists. "Colonel Kowalski," Master Kim said, his voice thick with respect. "I never expected to see you in my humble dojo." A murmur rippled through the class. Tyler's face began to pale as he looked between his employer and the elderly man he had been mocking for weeks. Franklin's posture shifted subtly. The carefully maintained facade of weakness fell away as he returned Master Kim's bow with perfect form. "It's been many years, Sung-ho," he said quietly. Master Kim straightened, his eyes bright with emotion. "Students," he announced, turning to face the class, "you have been training alongside one of the most legendary hand-to-hand combat instructors in Special Forces history." The silence in the room became absolute. Brett took an unconscious step backward, remembering the cold eyes that had frozen him in place earlier. "Colonel Franklin Kowalski trained me during my own military service," Master Kim continued. "He was the head instructor for the most elite combat units, teaching techniques so effective they were classified. His methods are still used in special operations training today." Tyler's phone slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering on the wooden floor. The sound echoed in the silent dojo like a gunshot. I watched him disable 5 armed attackers in less than 6 seconds, Master Kim said, his voice filled with admiration. His understanding of combat mechanics revolutionized close-quarters fighting techniques. We called him the Ghost because of how smoothly he moved. You never saw the strike coming until it was too late. Franklin stood straight now, his military bearing evident in every line of his body. The tremor in his hands had vanished completely. His eyes, sharp and alert, surveyed the stunned faces of his fellow students. But you could barely do basic forms, Brett stammered, his voice small and uncertain. A slight smile touched Franklin's lips. Sometimes the best way to observe is to remain unnoticed, he said quietly. Master Kim nodded in understanding. Colonel Kowalski taught us that deception is often the greatest advantage in combat. He could make himself appear weak, drunk, injured, whatever served his purpose. Many overconfident opponents learned too late that they had gravely underestimated him. Tyler had backed up against the wall, his face now completely drained of color. The phone on the floor still displayed the paused video of what he had thought was an elderly man's humiliation. Now he understood he had been systematically bullying one of the most dangerous combat specialists in military history. I remember the day you saved our entire unit, Master Kim said, turning back to Franklin. The way you moved through those insurgents, I had never seen anything like it. 23 of us came home because of your skills. The younger students exchanged wide-eyed looks. The frail old man they had laughed at was suddenly revealed as a legendary warrior, someone who had literally written the book on military hand-to-hand combat. The honor is mine, Master Kim, Franklin replied formally. You have built an excellent school here. Master Kim's face hardened slightly as he glanced at Tyler. Though perhaps some of our instructors need remedial lessons in respect and proper conduct. Tyler pushed himself away from the wall, his legs unsteady. Sir, I didn't know, he stammered, looking desperately between Master Kim and Franklin. Clearly, Master Kim said coldly. He turned to address the entire class again. You have all been granted an incredible opportunity. Colonel Kowalski's presence here is a gift, though I suspect some of you have squandered it through disgraceful behavior. Brett and Landon stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Several students who had laughed at Franklin's apparent struggles shifted uncomfortably, shame evident on their faces. Franklin's calm gaze swept across the room, lingering briefly on Tyler. The young instructor flinched under that steady look, remembering every mocking comment, every orchestrated humiliation, every moment of cruelty he had directed at a man who could have ended him with terrifying efficiency. The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming everyone's understanding of the past few weeks. What they had thought was the story of an elderly man struggling to learn martial arts was revealed as something entirely different, a master warrior choosing to endure disrespect and abuse while concealing his true nature. Master Kim bowed to Franklin again. Colonel, would you honor us by demonstrating some basic techniques? I believe several students here could benefit from understanding what real martial arts mastery looks like. Franklin returned the bow, and for the first time, a genuine smile crossed his weathered face. It would be my pleasure, old friend. Master Kim's expression grew serious as he continued addressing the class. What you witnessed these past weeks, Colonel Kowalski's apparent weakness, his trembling hands, his hesitation during basic movements, was not frailty at all. It was iron discipline. The Korean master gestured toward Franklin with deep respect. Every muscle in his body has been trained for lethal efficiency. Each movement he learned was designed for one purpose, to eliminate threats as quickly as possible. When you saw his hands shake, you were watching decades of combat muscle memory being forcefully contained. Franklin stood quietly, his steady presence now undeniable. The careful stoop was gone from his shoulders, replaced by the straight-backed posture of a career military officer. The techniques we teach here, Master Kim explained, are modified for sport and demonstration. But Colonel Kowalski's training... He paused, choosing his words carefully. His original techniques are too dangerous for regular practice. Each response is meant to disable or kill, not to score points. Brett shifted uncomfortably near the back of the group, but his face showed stubborn disbelief. Tyler's months of encouragement and his own pride wouldn't let him accept this complete reversal of everything he thought he knew. "That's ridiculous," Brett burst out, his voice carrying a nervous edge. He could barely keep his balance last week. How are we supposed to believe he's some kind of super soldier? Master Kim's eyes narrowed at the disrespectful outburst, but Franklin raised a calming hand. "A reasonable question," Franklin said quietly. "Seeing is often believing." Brett's face flushed red. Encouraged by Franklin's mild response, he stepped forward aggressively. "Then prove it. Show us these amazing techniques everyone's suddenly talking about." A tense silence fell over the dojo. Several students backed away, creating space between themselves and Brett. Even Tyler pressed himself harder against the wall, recognizing the dangerous territory his student was entering. "Brett," Master Kim warned sharply, "you overstep." But Brett was too far committed to back down now. His pride and weeks of feeling superior to the elderly man pushed him forward. "Come on, if you're really this legendary instructor, demonstrate on me. Unless all these stories are just talk." Franklin studied Brett with calm eyes. "Are you certain that's what you want, young man?" "Yeah, I'm certain." Brett dropped into a fighting stance, his movements cocky and aggressive. "Show us all these deadly moves." Master Kim started to intervene, but Franklin gave him a slight shake of the head. "Sometimes," the colonel said softly, "a practical lesson is needed." He turned to face Brett directly. The transformation in Franklin's bearing was subtle but profound. His movements became liquid smooth, his feet settling into perfect balance without any apparent effort. The tremor in his hands disappeared completely. "You should know," Franklin said evenly, "that I've been actively suppressing my training every moment in this dojo. When you attacked during sparring, my body wanted to respond with counter-strikes that would have caused serious injury. The shaking you mocked was the physical strain of fighting against responses drilled into muscle memory through thousands of repetitions." Brett's confident expression wavered slightly, but he maintained his aggressive stance. "Whatever. Are we doing this or not?" Franklin nodded once. "Attack when ready. I'll demonstrate one basic defensive sequence, carefully controlled." The younger man launched forward with a powerful combination, the same sequence he'd used to bully Franklin during their previous encounter. But this time, everything was different. Franklin's movement was almost too smooth to follow. There was no wasted motion, no telegraphing of intention. One moment Brett was attacking, the next he found himself completely immobilized, his face pressed against the training mat. He hadn't even seen Franklin move. The colonel held him there with what appeared to be minimal effort, using leverage points that made Brett's strength useless. The young man's arm was locked in a position that promised excruciating pain if he struggled. "In actual combat," Franklin explained calmly to the stunned class, "this hold would be followed immediately by a strike to the base of the skull or a cervical dislocation, but this is a demonstration only." He released Brett, who scrambled away, his face a mixture of shock and embarrassment. Tyler had slid down to sit on the floor, his legs seemingly unable to support him. The realization of what could have happened during weeks of tormenting this man left him pale and shaking. Every mocking word, every orchestrated humiliation now played back in his mind with horrifying new context. "Colonel Kowalski chose restraint," Master Kim said into the silence. "He could have responded to your disrespect with devastating efficiency at any time. Instead, he showed true martial spirit by containing his abilities and enduring your shameful behavior with dignity." Brett stood slowly, rubbing his arm where Franklin had controlled him. The young man's entire worldview had been upended in the span of 30 seconds. I'm sorry," he stammered. "I had no idea." Few did, Franklin replied simply. That was rather the point. The tension in the dojo reached a breaking point as Brett struggled to his feet, his pride visibly wounded. Landon stepped forward to support his friend, while Tyler moved away from the wall, his face flushed with anger at seeing his authority challenged. That was just a lucky move, Brett spat, rubbing his shoulder. You caught me off guard. Landon cracked his knuckles menacingly. Yeah, let's see how you handle both of us at once. Franklin remained perfectly still, his posture relaxed but alert. I strongly advise against this course of action, he said quietly. But if you insist on a further demonstration, I will oblige. Master Kim shook his head in disappointment, but made no move to intervene. The students formed a wider circle, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and concern. Brett and Landon exchanged quick glances before charging forward simultaneously. Their attack was aggressive but uncoordinated, exactly the kind of emotional response Franklin had dealt with countless times during his military career. What happened next left the entire class speechless. Franklin's movements were fluid and economical, each action flowing seamlessly into the next. As Brett threw a wild haymaker, Franklin simply wasn't there anymore. The colonel had shifted slightly, allowing Brett's momentum to carry him forward. In one smooth motion, Franklin redirected Brett's charge, sending him stumbling into Landon. Before either young man could recover, Franklin had already moved. His hands found pressure points and joint locks with surgical precision. There was nothing flashy about his techniques, no high kicks or spinning moves, just devastatingly efficient combat maneuvers honed through decades of real-world application. Landon tried to grab Franklin from behind, but the veteran reversed the hold instantly. Within seconds, Landon found himself face down on the mat, his arm locked in a position that made him yelp in pain. Brett attempted to help, but was quickly neutralized by a series of rapid strikes to nerve clusters that left his right arm temporarily useless. Tyler, watching his students being systematically dismantled, finally snapped. He rushed forward with all the skill of his MMA background, throwing a combination of punches that would have overwhelmed most opponents. Franklin's response was almost casual. He slipped inside Tyler's guard, his weathered hands finding vulnerable points that no sport fighting ever taught. The instructor's attacks were turned against him with ruthless efficiency. A quick series of joint manipulations left Tyler gasping on the ground alongside his students. The entire exchange had taken less than 60 seconds. Franklin stepped back, his breathing calm and measured. There had been no wasted movement, no unnecessary force. He had simply solved the problem of 3 aggressive attackers with the same clinical efficiency he'd once used to train Special Forces operators. Brett, Landon, and Tyler lay groaning on the mat, each nursing various holds and locks that had left them completely helpless. The power dynamic in the dojo had shifted dramatically. Every student who had witnessed Franklin's earlier humiliation now understood the incredible restraint he had shown. This, Master Kim addressed the silent class, is the difference between martial arts for sport and techniques developed for survival. What you just witnessed was not about competition or showing off. These are battlefield-proven methods, designed to end conflicts quickly and decisively. Franklin's posture relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained sharp and alert. I hope this demonstrates why I chose to suppress these responses during regular training. These techniques are not suitable for practice or demonstration. They are meant for life and death situations only. The 3 younger men slowly got to their feet, their earlier bravado completely erased. Tyler couldn't meet Franklin's eyes, the shame of his previous behavior finally hitting home. Brett and Landon stood awkwardly, their bodies still tingling from nerve strikes they'd never encountered in regular training. "Colonel," Tyler managed to say, his voice hoarse, we... "Save it," Franklin said firmly, but without malice. "I didn't demonstrate this to humiliate you, though you certainly tried hard enough to humiliate me. I showed you because you needed to understand that true martial skill comes with responsibility. Power without wisdom is dangerous, Experience without humility is worthless. The students remained motionless, absorbing the profound shift in their understanding. The elderly man they had mocked and bullied had turned out to be more capable than all of them combined. More importantly, he had chosen restraint when he could have responded with devastating force at any time. The mark of a true warrior, Master Kim added solemnly, is not in the fights they win, but in the fights they choose not to engage. Colonel Kowalski demonstrated this principle every time he walked into this dojo and endured your disrespect with dignity. Franklin stood at ease, once again appearing as the calm, elderly gentleman who had first walked through the door. But now everyone could see past the surface, understanding that his apparent frailty had been an illusion, one born of conscious choice and incredible self-control. Tyler Morrison paced in the empty locker room, his phone pressed against his ear. His hands trembled with a mixture of rage and humiliation as he waited for the call to connect. The events from earlier that day kept replaying in his mind, being taken down so easily, watching his students witness his defeat, seeing the respect he'd worked so hard to build crumble in mere seconds. "Joey?" "Yeah, it's Tyler," he said when the line clicked. "Listen, I need a favor. Remember how you said you owed me one after I covered for you at that tournament? Time to collect." He lowered his voice, though the dojo was nearly empty. "I've got this problem at my studio. Some old guy made me look bad in front of my whole class. Real bad. I need you and a couple of the boys to help me send a message." Tyler's former training partner's gravelly voice crackled through the speaker. "What kind of message we talking about?" "The kind that reminds people why they shouldn't disrespect me in my own dojo." Tyler's jaw clenched. "Bring Mike and Chris. You know, the heavy hitters. I want this done right." Through the locker room window, Tyler watched Franklin completing his evening training session. The old man moved through his forms with careful precision, showing no sign that he had thoroughly dominated 3 younger men just hours earlier. The sight made Tyler's blood boil. "Tomorrow night, after class," Tyler continued, "the old man always parks in the far corner of the lot, away from the street lights. Nobody else will be around. I'll make sure of it." He listened to Joey's response, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, just rough him up enough to make the point. Nothing too permanent, but make sure he understands what happens when people try to make me look stupid." Tyler ended the call and slipped his phone into his pocket, his heart racing with anticipation. He had spent years building his reputation in the local martial arts community. One afternoon of humiliation wasn't going to erase everything he'd worked for. The old man needed to learn his place. The next evening, Franklin finished his training as usual, unaware of the danger waiting in the gathering darkness. Tyler watched from his office as Joey's black SUV pulled into the far end of the parking lot, hiding between 2 delivery trucks. Mike and Chris were already inside, former cage fighters whose size and aggression had made them feared even in professional circles. Tyler had carefully orchestrated the evening, ensuring all other students and staff left early. Only Franklin remained, methodically packing his gear and changing into his street clothes. The elderly veteran moved with the same measured calm he always showed, completely oblivious to the trap being set. "Good session today, Colonel," Tyler called out with false cheerfulness as Franklin headed for the door. "Drive safe now." Franklin nodded politely, his ingrained military courtesy still present despite their earlier confrontation. "Good evening, Mr. Morrison." Tyler watched through the window as Franklin made his way across the parking lot, his slight limp more pronounced after the evening's training. The 3 men in the SUV remained perfectly still, waiting for their target to reach the perfect spot between the vehicles. Joey had done this sort of thing before. Tyler knew his former training partner's reputation for handling problems in the fighting circuit. The plan was simple. Surround the old man, rough him up enough to send a message, then disappear before anyone could respond. No weapons, no permanent damage, just enough violence to restore the natural order. Franklin reached his car and began fishing for his keys, his back turned to the SUV. Tyler's heart pounded as he saw the vehicle's doors slowly open. Joey, Mike, and Chris emerged like shadows, their muscled frames making Franklin look even more vulnerable by comparison. Tyler gripped the windowsill, his knuckles white with tension. This was it, the moment his authority would be restored. The old man would learn that respect had to be earned through force, not just some fancy military background. The three fighters moved with practiced coordination, spreading out to cut off any escape routes. Joey, a 6'4" heavyweight with cauliflower ears and a broken nose that had never healed right, took point. Mike and Chris, nearly as large, flanked out to either side. Tyler watched the scene unfold like a predator observing its prey, all his frustration and wounded pride focused on the elderly man who had dared to expose his weaknesses. The parking lot had become an arena, and this time, there would be no witnesses to Franklin's defeat. Franklin still hadn't noticed the approaching danger, absorbed in the simple task of unlocking his car door. The three fighters were less than 20 feet away now, closing in with the confidence of men who had done this many times before. Tyler leaned forward, his breath fogging the window glass. Everything was falling into place exactly as he had planned. His reputation would be restored, his authority unquestioned. The old man would finally understand the price of humiliating Tyler Morrison in his own dojo. The fluorescent lights of the parking lot cast long shadows as Joey and his companions moved into their final positions. Franklin stood completely exposed, outnumbered, and unaware of the impending attack. Tyler's conspiracy had transformed from mere harassment into something much darker, a premeditated act of violence against an elderly veteran. The three fighters tensed, ready to spring their trap, while Tyler watched from his vantage point, secure in the knowledge that his problem was about to be solved permanently. The parking lot's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as Franklin approached his car, keys jingling softly in his weathered hands. The evening air had grown cold, and his breath formed small clouds in front of his face. His knee ached from the day's training, but he'd learned to accept such discomfort as part of his recovery process. A sudden movement caught his attention, the sound of footsteps on asphalt coming from multiple directions. Franklin's combat-trained senses, honed through decades of military service, instantly recognized the tactical approach pattern. Three men were moving to surround him, using the parked cars as cover. The largest of the three, a hulking figure with cauliflower ears, stepped into view first. The streetlight glinted off something metallic in his hand, a steel baton. The other two emerged from the shadows carrying similar weapons. Their stance and movement betrayed their fighting experience, but Franklin noticed the telltale signs of street brawlers rather than disciplined warriors. "Evening, old-timer," the leader called out, twirling his baton. "Heard you've been causing some trouble for our friend Tyler." Franklin's posture shifted imperceptibly. The slight tremor in his hands disappeared completely. His breathing slowed, and his eyes took on the cold, calculating look of a combat veteran assessing threats. This wasn't a dojo demonstration or controlled sparring match. These men intended real harm. "I recommend you boys walk away now," Franklin said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command that had once directed Special Forces operations. "This won't end well for you." The three men laughed, continuing their approach. They moved with the confidence of predators who had done this before, completely unaware they were facing someone far more dangerous than their usual victims. "Last chance," Franklin warned, but they were already committed to their attack. The leader lunged forward with his baton, aiming for Franklin's head. In that instant, 4 decades of lethal combat training took over. Franklin's movements became fluid and precise, stripped of all the hesitation he'd shown in the dojo. This wasn't practice. This was survival. Franklin stepped inside the baton swing, his arthritic hands suddenly moving with surgical precision. He trapped the leader's weapon arm and executed a joint lock that ended with a sharp crack. The baton clattered to the ground along with its screaming owner, who clutched his now useless elbow. The second attacker charged from the left, swinging his weapon in a wild arc. Franklin's response was instantaneous and brutal. A precise strike to the throat collapsed the man's windpipe, followed by a knee strike that shattered his ribs. The second assailant dropped, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The third man, seeing his companions dispatched so efficiently, hesitated for a crucial moment. Franklin exploited the opening without mercy. A combination of strikes targeted vulnerable pressure points, followed by a throw that sent the attacker headfirst into the concrete. The impact echoed through the empty parking lot. In less than 30 seconds, all three attackers lay incapacitated. The leader continued to scream about his shattered elbow, while the second man wheezed through his crushed throat. The third remained motionless, blood pooling beneath his head. Franklin pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services with steady hands. His voice remained calm as he reported the attempted assault and requested medical assistance. Years of combat experience had taught him to handle the aftermath of violence with the same efficiency as the violence itself. Through the dojo's window, Tyler watched in horror as his plan unraveled. The three experienced fighters he'd hired lay broken on the pavement, taken apart by the elderly veteran with terrifying ease. This hadn't been the controlled takedowns from earlier. This was the full expression of Franklin's military training, unleashed without restraint. Sirens wailed in the distance as Franklin knelt to check the third attacker's pulse. His movements were precise and controlled, showing no sign of the frailty he'd displayed in class. The trembling hands and careful movements had been conscious choices, meant to suppress decades of muscle memory designed for lethal combat. Police cars and ambulances soon flooded the parking lot. The three attackers were loaded into separate ambulances, their injuries requiring immediate medical attention. Franklin gave his statement to the officers, describing the attempted assault and his actions in clear professional terms. The parking lot confrontation had proven what Master Kim had tried to explain. Franklin's apparent weakness had been an act of mercy, not limitation. When faced with genuine threats, his true capabilities emerged with devastating effect. The difference between his controlled dojo performance and this lethal display demonstrated just how much restraint he'd been exercising during training. Emergency lights painted the scene in alternating red and blue as medical teams worked to stabilize the injured attackers. Franklin stood calmly amid the chaos, his combat-hardened demeanor a stark contrast to the frail, elderly man who had first walked into the dojo. The facade had been stripped away, revealing the lethal warrior beneath. The following morning, police investigators reviewed the dojo's security footage with grim expressions. The cameras had captured more than just the parking lot assault. They revealed the full scope of Tyler's conspiracy. Clear video showed Tyler meeting with the attackers earlier that day, pointing out Franklin's car and exchanging money. The footage left no doubt about his role in orchestrating the violence. Detective Sarah Martinez leaned forward, studying Tyler's face on the screen as he gestured animatedly to his hired thugs. "We've got him dead to rights," she said, pausing the video. "Conspiracy to commit assault, maybe attempted murder given the weapons involved." The investigation expanded beyond the parking lot attack. Investigators discovered Brett and Landon's social media posts, documenting months of systematic harassment. Their phones contained group messages with Tyler, planning various ways to humiliate and provoke Franklin. The digital trail painted a damning picture of calculated abuse. 2 days later, Tyler Morrison sat in handcuffs at the police station, his arrogant demeanor crumbling as Detective Martinez laid out the evidence against him. "We have you on video planning the attack," she said, sliding photographs across the table. "Your text messages with Brett and Landon show this was part of an ongoing campaign of harassment." Tyler's face went pale as he realized the full extent of his exposure. His lawyer, hastily hired by his parents, advised him to remain silent, but the damage was done. The charges were serious: conspiracy to commit assault, criminal harassment, and endangerment of an elderly person. His martial arts career was effectively over. Brett and Landon faced their own reckonings. Police officers arrived at their homes with search warrants, confiscating phones and computers. The evidence of their participation in both the harassment and the setup of the parking lot attack was overwhelming. Their parents watched in shock as their sons were led away in handcuffs, charged as accomplices to Tyler's crimes. Master Kim called an emergency meeting at the dojo. Standing before his assembled students, the elderly Korean master's face showed deep disappointment. "This school stands for honor, respect, and discipline," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Brett Hoffman and Landon Cruz are permanently expelled. Their actions, and those of Tyler Morrison, represent everything we stand against." The dojo's insurance company launched their own investigation, concerned about liability. Their lawyers interviewed Franklin for hours, finally hearing the full story of the abuse he had endured. Franklin's military bearing remained steady as he detailed months of escalating harassment. "I didn't speak up earlier because I've handled worse," Franklin explained to the investigators. "But these young men needed to learn that actions have consequences. What they did wasn't just dishonorable, it was criminal." The insurance company's findings were devastating. They documented systematic failures in oversight that had allowed the harassment to continue unchecked. The dojo faced serious liability issues, with the insurance representatives recommending a complete overhaul of their supervision and safety protocols. In the courthouse, Franklin testified at Tyler's preliminary hearing. His voice remained steady as he described the progression from verbal abuse to physical intimidation, and finally to the orchestrated assault. The judge listened intently, particularly to Franklin's description of how the attackers had been armed with potentially lethal weapons. The defendant didn't just abuse his position as an instructor, the prosecutor argued. He conspired to cause serious harm to an elderly veteran who had shown remarkable restraint in the face of ongoing harassment. This wasn't a spontaneous fight, it was a calculated attack. Tyler's parents sat in stunned silence as their son was denied bail, deemed a potential threat to witnesses. Their previous pride in their son's martial arts career had turned to shame as the full extent of his actions became clear. The judge's words were unequivocal. The evidence shows a disturbing pattern of escalating violence and abuse of authority. Brett and Landon accepted plea deals, agreeing to testify against Tyler in exchange for reduced charges. Their statements revealed how Tyler had manipulated them, using their desire for acceptance to turn them into willing participants in his campaign of harassment. Both young men faced probation and community service, their futures permanently marked by their poor choices. The legal consequences rippled through the martial arts community. The State Athletic Commission revoked Tyler's instructor certification, citing gross misconduct and endangerment of students. Other dojos in the area implemented stricter oversight policies, determined to prevent similar abuse from occurring in their schools. Master Kim used the incident as a teaching moment for his remaining students. "True martial arts is about respect, discipline, and using our skills responsibly," he told them. "Colonel Kowalski showed us what that means through his actions. Even when provoked, he chose restraint over violence until he had no other choice." The security footage, text messages, and social media posts had transformed months of hidden abuse into clear evidence of criminal behavior. Justice was being served through the legal system, holding Tyler and his accomplices accountable for their choices. What had begun as simple mockery had escalated into serious crimes, with consequences that would follow the perpetrators for years to come. 2 weeks after the arrests, Franklin sat in his favorite armchair, a cup of steaming coffee warming his weathered hands. Penny perched on the couch across from him, her eyes full of questions that had gone unasked for too long. "Grandpa," she began softly, "why didn't you tell me about your military training? About what you really did in the service?" Franklin's eyes grew distant, focusing on memories he rarely shared. "Some skills aren't meant for bragging about, sweetheart. What I taught in the military, it wasn't about winning tournaments or earning belts. It was about survival." Penny leaned forward, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Is that why your hands used to shake during class? You weren't weak at all. You were holding back." "Decades of muscle memory," Franklin nodded, his voice quiet. "Every time that young instructor pushed me, my body wanted to respond the way it was trained. But that kind of response, it's not meant for a classroom. It took more control to pull those punches than to throw them. Tears welled in Penny's eyes as she finally understood the weight her grandfather had carried alone. All those years of silence about your service, you were protecting us from knowing that side of you. Franklin reached across and squeezed her hand. The things I taught in Special Forces, they change a person. I wanted you to know me as your grandfather, not as the man who trained others to... He left the sentence unfinished, but Penny understood. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Master Kim stood on the porch, his dignified bearing unchanged by recent events. He bowed deeply to Franklin before entering. "Colonel," Master Kim said, settling into an offered chair, "I've come with a proposal. Our dojo needs healing after recent events. We need an instructor who understands both the technical aspects of martial arts and the moral responsibility that comes with such knowledge." Franklin raised an eyebrow, already guessing where this was heading. Master Kim continued, "I would be honored if you would consider taking a teaching position. Your expertise is invaluable, but more importantly, your character is exactly what our students need to see." "I'm not exactly the typical instructor," Franklin said carefully. "My methods weren't designed for sports or competitions." Master Kim smiled. "Precisely why we need you. You can teach our advanced students something far more valuable than tournament techniques. You can teach them when not to fight." Penny watched the exchange with bright eyes. "Grandpa, this could be perfect. You've always said staying active is important, and now you could help others while doing it." Franklin sat quietly for a moment, considering. His hands, which had shaken so much during those first classes, were now steady as he set down his coffee cup. "On one condition," he said finally. "I teach it my way. No shortcuts, no rushing through the basics. They learn control first, technique second." "I would expect nothing less from the man who taught me," Master Kim replied, with another respectful bow. 3 days later, Franklin stood before his first advanced class. The students, many of whom had witnessed his parking lot demonstration, watched him with a mixture of awe and nervousness. But Franklin's bearing was different now. No longer hiding his capabilities, he moved with the fluid grace of a lifelong warrior. "The deadliest technique I ever learned," he began, his voice carrying easily across the dojo, "was how to walk away from a fight. Anyone can throw a punch. True warriors know when not to." He demonstrated a simple joint lock, showing how the same movement could either control or destroy. The difference between mercy and destruction is often just a few degrees of pressure. Your strength isn't in how much damage you can do. It's in choosing not to do it. The students practiced under his watchful eye, and Franklin moved among them, making corrections. His hands remained steady as he adjusted stances and demonstrated grips. There was no need to suppress his training anymore. Instead, he channeled it into teaching. Penny watched from the doorway, seeing her grandfather in a new light. The man who had always been her protective, loving grandpa was also a highly trained combat instructor. Yet somehow these two identities no longer seemed at odds. They were both parts of who he was, a man whose greatest strength lay in his compassion. As class ended, Franklin gathered his students close. "Remember," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "the most dangerous fighter isn't the one who wants to prove himself. It's the one who has nothing to prove, who chooses restraint because he understands the true cost of violence." The students bowed deeply, showing genuine respect rather than the fear or mockery Franklin had once endured in this same room. As they filed out, Master Kim approached Franklin with a proud smile. "You've found your new purpose," he observed quietly. Franklin nodded, watching his students leave. "Teaching them to fight is easy," he replied. "Teaching them when not to, that's the real challenge. And maybe that's exactly what I'm meant to do now." Penny joined them, slipping her arm through her grandfather's. The three stood together, looking out over the empty dojo that had become a place of transformation rather than humiliation. Franklin's journey from student to teacher had completed a circle he hadn't known he needed to close, bringing him a sense of peace he hadn't felt since his military days. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.